With the advent of photography, paranormal experiencers of all types gained a modicum of traction against skeptics. Images of ghosts, manifested psychic abilities, monsters, and strange objects in the sky appeared in photos throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. These photos represented the first evidence beyond words and recollections, something tangible that could be measured and analyzed. Unusual subject matter aside, it is perfectly reasonable for photographs to be considered circumstantial evidence, as the veracity of the photo is the only thing in question. If a UFO is photographically depicted hovering over a meadow in broad daylight, one certainly cannot question whether the UFO is part of the picture. One can, however, ask if the contextual information surrounding the photo is truthful, or if other measurable features in the image are consistent, the answers to which would ultimately lend credence to or cast doubt on the photo itself. Perhaps the object is only a model or a digital contrivance, a consideration for anything taken after the late 1980s and the birth of Photoshop. Perhaps the object is in fact real, but its essence is misunderstood. It could be an unusual shaped balloon, or even a long-forgotten streetlight. Perhaps, after analysis, the object seems to be genuine and unexplainable, but the narrative given by the photographer is completely incongruous with what is shown, implying a hoax. Various theories about the origin or nature of our hypothetical photo can be tested independently and, in turn, eliminated as explanations. One can even attempt to recreate the photograph using simple, well-known camera tricks, such as forced perspective or double exposure. Although recreations by nature are never absolutely conclusive, any more than proclaiming all doves to be white and showing a supportive photo proves the absence of black doves. Moving images of paranormal subjects fall under the same standards of scrutiny as their static counterparts. As with photographs, misidentifications can be committed to video without any ill intent. A boat wake lapping a distant log may appear to be a lake monster. A puff of steam from a hidden leak in a pipe might seem like a wayward apparition. A flock of common cranes 10,000 feet high might look like a meandering fleet of flying saucers. Since it is substantially more difficult to fake, one could be forgiven for declaring a movie authentic out of hand. But knowing this to be the case, a hoaxer might put substantially more time and effort into faking a movie, thus canceling out any added gravitas inherent in the medium. One common objection to the claims of paranormal photographs, be they of cryptids, UFOs, ghosts, or anything else, is that one should expect a tsunami of convincing photos, since a huge portion of the world's population spends a good part of their day with a camera in their pocket. While this is indeed food for thought, it is not as blistering an indictment as it first seems. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Paranormal events, if they do occur, are by their nature outside the bound of normal experience, and may therefore be outside one's everyday attention span. They are also typically very fleeting, often only lasting a few seconds. Unless an observer has a camera at the ready, and is in the process of using it when the event takes place, it is very possible he or she would not capture it. For every well-composed, genuinely intriguing image, 1,000 obvious fakes and 10,000 ambiguous misidentifications are produced. The fact that more people have access to decent camera equipment only means that there are a proportionally higher number of people who are hoaxing images or drawing incorrect conclusions. There is no reason to believe that the number of genuine paranormal events rises and falls in tandem with the number of available cameras. For example, the crash of the airship Hindenburg was a unique moment in history. No one would argue, because there aren't hundreds of films depicting a similar modern-day disaster, the original 1937 disaster wasn't real. And no one would expect there to be hundreds of thousands more Hindenburgs each year, simply because hundreds of thousands more people have cameras on hand. Paranormal encounters may be sorely wanting of physical evidence, but their existence should be determined by the quality of the photos, not the quantity. That said, one should always be wary of hoaxes, which, unlike all paranormal phenomena, incontrovertibly exist. In the summer of 1963, the Reverend Kenneth F. Lord wandered alone through the Church of Christ the Counselor on the grounds of Newby Hall and snapped photos of the interior, eventually deciding to capture the elaborately decorated altar on film. Upon having the film developed, the Reverend was supposedly shocked and more than a little confused. A stark, menacing, semi-transparent figure was now standing beside the altar. Although countless churches and grave sites dot the English countryside, The church at Newby was relatively new, built between 1871 and 1876, not a place one would expect to find a monk from several centuries past. There was no history of hauntings at the location, and not much since the famous photo. This fact would seem as evidence against the common reasoning that ghosts haunt locations that are of strong emotional significance. As to the nature of the photo itself, it is highly unlikely it is the result of an accidental double exposure, like that of the Lord Combermere. A large man in monastic garb probably didn't stumble into the frame while an ignorant reverend lord exposed the film. In fact, the supposed ghost can accurately be described as posing for a photo. The general appearance of the figure is admittedly quite striking, even ghoulish, and though it would seem so, this may not be an affectation invented by a prankster. Medieval and late medieval monks occasionally shrouded their faces in a similar fashion, often due to some disfigurement or disease, such as leprosy. This lesser-known detail could indicate something strange is actually going on. A singularly unique feature of the ghost is its size, which has been estimated by various researchers to be in excess of 8 feet, perhaps as tall as 9 feet. No doubt this number is derived from comparisons with the known sizes of the steps leading up to the altar, as well as the altar itself, which is a known distance from the camera. These estimates are probably somewhat overly generous, as other, decidedly non-paranormal photos over the years, including a double exposure taken by 5'6" photographer Dave Webster, seem to indicate a more reasonable height. The figure, whatever it was less a giant and more uncommonly tall. Of course, the figure could be standing on a box or a chair hidden under the draping robe. On an interesting related note, the fact that the robe drapes over the bottom step as it does makes one wonder about the exact relationship a ghostly spirit has with its environment. The ghostly garments of a bona fide spectre might flow up and down steps as if they were solid matter, but a double exposure hoaxer would absolutely flow as if they were solid, because they are. It seems then either Reverend Kenneth Lord unknowingly took a photo of the ghost of a giant monk wandering the grounds of a church that was constructed centuries after his death, or someone with a little knowledge of monastic fashion decided to have a little fun and create a wonderfully spooky photo, destined to be argued over for the better part of a century. In early December of 1924, James Courtney and Michael Meehan, deckhands aboard the SS Watertown, an oil tanker en route from California to New Orleans, were instructed to clean a cargo tank in the ship's hold. The bodies of the men were found a short time later, both believed to have succumbed to toxic fumes, their deaths deemed a tragic accident by Captain Keith Tracy and a reminder of the hazards of maritime life. On December 4th, upon nearing the Panama Canal, Captain Tracy had the men's bodies duly buried at sea after a brief memorial service, a traditional and not uncommon practice at the time. For some days afterward, throughout the remainder of the trip, crewmen repeatedly claimed to see the faces of their fallen comrades in the churning waves of the sea. The faces would appear amidst the foam and whitecaps, linger for as many as 10 seconds, then fade away. Upon arriving at New Orleans, Captain Tracy reported the strange goings-on to officials with Cities Service, currently known as Citgo, the company that owned the Watertown. The officials intrigued, they asked the captain to attempt to photograph the phenomenon, and he purchased a camera before sailing on to New York City to do so. During a subsequent voyage near the Panama Canal, either Tracy or a member of his crew snapped as many as 6 photographs of the ocean as seen from the deck of the ship. The camera, film still loaded, was then locked in the ship's safe to prevent any tampering. Once back on shore, the camera was released to company officials, who transported it to New York, where the film was developed by Culver Pictures. Out of a total of 6 exposures, 5 showed nothing out of the ordinary. The 6th, however, showed distinctly human faces among the waves off the ship's starboard side. Or at least that's how the tale is usually told. Surprisingly, most of the details of the oft-related ghost stories seem to have legs, or sea legs in this case. The Cities Service magazine Service was indeed the first place to publish the famous photo, though admittedly 5 years after the original incident, and a large copy of the photo was known to be on display in their New York office for several years afterwards. The ship SS Watertown did exist, as did ill-fated sailors Michael Meehan and James Courtney. The 2 men were apparently working in a cofferdam, a void between 2 bulkheads, when a gaseous cloud overcame them. A chief mate by the name of Costi Taviola courageously retrieved the men by pulling them out through a long access tube, only realizing in the end his efforts had been in vain, as they had died before rescue. Despite being taken in 1924, the Watertown photo only entered public consciousness 10 years later, due in large part to the efforts made by British-born paranormal investigator Hereward Carrington, arguably the first person outside the offices of city service to take a serious interest in the subject. The photo in the form most commonly found in paranormal books and websites is actually a heavily cropped version of the original, supposedly taken by Captain Tracy, the cropped image likely originating from an article in the December 1963 issue of Fate magazine. Once thought lost, the original uncropped photo was found in 2020 by investigator Blake Smith in a Des Moines Register Sunday newspaper insert from February of 1935. Using a photograph of the SS Bald Hill, a sister ship of the Watertown, as there is no known photo of the Watertown save the ghostly image in question, the photographer's position in the Watertown photo can be calculated with reasonable precision. Noting the position of the Dorade boxes and surrounding support structures, the camera's location seems to be aft of the ship's forecastle, just forward of the engine house. The section of the photo that is usually seen in the cropped image is here, a pair of what seem to be human faces against the white seafoam. Through experimentation, Smith determined the faces are about 14 meters from the camera aperture. The photo itself is quite dramatic, even disregarding the supposedly ghostly faces, and does make one briefly wonder if the shot was taken for that reason alone. Regardless, both cropped and uncropped versions of the photograph present a number of anomalies. One should remember that the early 20th century was rife with photographic fakery. Even the smallest red flag has weighty implications. Assuming Blake Smith's estimation of distance is accurate, the faces in the uncropped photo would be very large, perhaps 3 or 4 meters tall. Gigantic faces were never mentioned in any version of the events, not by anyone at City's services, Captain Tracy, nor any of his crew. This isn't a particularly egregious oversight, as the apparent size of a mysterious face, seen from a modest distance in the midst of a chaotic seascape, may not be that easy to discern. A 3-meter-tall face doesn't necessarily seem very gigantic compared to a quadrillion gallons of churning water. One could even argue that had the faces not been of sufficient size, they wouldn't have been noticed at all. However, the size of the faces becomes much more pertinent when considering Hereward Carrington's estimation that the faces were 1,000 feet distant, a claim that would indicate the faces were 100 to 200 feet tall, which seems intuitively absurd. The face on the left is suspiciously set between 2 upright staves. This could be a convenient location to hide a seam or airbrushing mask, as the straight edge of the stave runs the entire upper half of the image. This, of course, isn't the case with the right-hand face, which is completely detached from foreground objects. This could be a case of natural pareidolia, the same phenomenon that one experiences when one sees a face in the shadows on a textured bedroom wall, which in turn suggests a hoaxer might use such a happy accident of illusion to lend credence to a fabricated edition. Most, if not all, copies of the cropped photo have a pair of large arrows superimposed, indicating the faces among the waves, which weirdly are not difficult to make out. These arrows could be hiding something incriminating. There is also the fact that both faces look suspiciously alike, almost as if they were copies of each other. Obviously, this is a subjective point, softened somewhat by the fact that faces are more or less structured the same. But not all faces have sunken eyes and a painter's brush mustache. The pedigree of the original photograph is of dubious nature. As stated, the first major investigation into the photo was led by Hereward Carrington, about a decade after the photo's origin. The next major attempt was made by writer Michael Mann in preparation for an article for the December 1963 issue of Fate magazine, nearly 30 years later. Mann seemed to uncover a wealth of information above and beyond that found by Carrington, despite both men using virtually the same avenues of evidence. Quote, "The story had evolved to the point that not only did the negatives get taken to a lab and everyone had been professional and verified there was no fraud, but also that the negatives were investigated by a detective agency and found to be without fraud." Unquote. Blake Smith dutifully contacted the private security bureau Securitas, having long since purchased the Burns Detective Agency, which Mann had claimed had examined the photo and concluded it to be authentic. Securitas had no records involving the SS Watertown or the investigation of the related photograph. Of course, case records do occasionally become lost. It has also been suggested the popular cropped version of the photo, which originated in the 1963 Fate article, was actually doctored by Mr. Man himself, a well-known UFO fanatic, widely suspected of previously fabricating a number of UFO photographs with the help of a journalist named Jonas Cover. This theory is somewhat strained, however, when one considers the fact that a photo showing something strange had to exist for a considerable period of time before man's involvement. Carrington certainly thought something was worth looking into. It seems the SS Watertown photo started its life as a dramatic image mounted to the wall of a corporate office, perhaps a reception room, where visitors would undoubtedly ask about its origins. Perhaps the photo was manipulated to show ghostly faces, or capitalize on a freak occurrence of pareidolia. Over time, the backstory grew more elaborate, until whatever truth existed was lost within the weeds of time. Of course, later embellishments don't invalidate early facts. Someone snapped the photo from the deck of the Watertown. Their reasons for doing so are the single most important unanswered question. If the photo was taken strictly for posterity, the ghostly aspect of the story was undoubtedly added later. If, however, the photographer was trying to capture the image of something strange, we will forever be left wondering how much of the story isn't a hoax. This image, captured by Mabel Chinnery, was supposedly taken of her husband, Jim, while sitting in their automobile after just having visited the grave of her mother, a Mrs. Ellen Hamill. In the image, Jim Chinnery is clearly visible in the driver's seat, while another figure, in shadow, is stoically gazing forward from the rear. The figure was not seen by Mrs. Chinnery during the initial exposure, its existence pointed out to her by a friend when viewing the photo upon development. According to Mr. Chinnery in a later interview, the mysterious figure is positioned where his wife's mother typically sat whenever going for a drive, in order to more easily facilitate conversation. This fact, coupled with the striking resemblance the backseat figure had to the recently deceased Mrs. Hamill, complete with a similar set of glasses, pointed the Chinnerys toward the unnerving conclusion that the figure was in fact the ghost of Mrs. Chinnery's mother. The original photo had been first published on April 19, 1959, in the Sunday Pictorial, now known as the Sunday Mirror. The photo gained substantial fame when published in the United States for Parade magazine at the end of the following June. In 1985, a computer-assisted photo analysis was performed by computer scientist Tim Newton and physicist Dr. Stephen Gull. This analysis, along with other less formal undertakings over the years, have noted some intriguing anomalies. The white collar of Mrs. Hamill's ghost appears to overlap the stanchion of the driver's side window frame. This would seem to indicate the image of the ghost has somehow been laid over the image of the car, which would normally be between the viewer and the ghost. This could possibly be due to exposure bleed, in which a highly exposed section of the film inadvertently spills over into a contrasting area. It could also be due to the creation of a double exposure, although this may have been accidental. Mechanical cameras, such as the Eastman Kodak Brownie, a very common camera in 1959, which may have been used by Mrs. Chinnery, require the operator to wind the film to the next available exposure, and would typically employ some sort of manual prevention switch to prevent the accidental opening of the shutter before the winding took place. If Mrs. Chinnery forgot to engage the switch between the photo of her husband and the previous photo on the film roll, presumably of her mother, this could have resulted in an accidental double exposure. Another strange feature which may support the double exposure theory is the dark protrusion visible against the back seat to the left of the ghost's head. At first glance, this shape seems to be similar to the end of a shoulder, but if this were the case, the shoulder of Mrs. Hamill's ghost would have to be unrealistically wide. Of course, there is no way at this point to determine if there is some other explanation for the protrusion. The automobile in the photo is either a Mark III or Mark IV Hillman Minx, produced circa 1949. More recent images of this model have been taken and can be used to estimate spatial relationships within the original subject, although these recent images are not purpose-specific, so angles and lighting are only approximations. Keeping this in mind, it does appear the protrusion is not a normal part of the rear seat. Again, if Mrs. Chinnery accidentally produced a double exposure, exposing the later image of her husband over an earlier image of her mother sitting in something like an armchair with a broad back, the ghostly photo would be prosaically explained. However, the double exposure explanation is not without problems. Double exposures, unless done in a very careful and deliberate way, do not only affect localized portions of an image, such as the backseat of a car. If the Chinnery photo was the result of a double exposure, we should expect to see more indications of the preceding photo appearing throughout the body of the car as well. Mrs. Chinnery was quite certain that she had taken a photo of her mother's grave just before taking a photo of her husband as he waited in the family car, which was the final image on the film roll. If Mrs. Chinnery's recollection was accurate, there is no conceivable way an image of her mother in an unrelated context could have been accidentally imposed onto the later photo, as it would have been necessary to manually wind the film roll back an appropriate amount to properly take a double exposure. If a deliberate double exposure was created, strongly implying a series of gross fabrications on the part of the Chinnerys, one would have to credit Mrs. Chinnery with foreknowledge of her mother's death, the foresight to snap a photo of her mother in such a pose as to uncannily blend into the rear seat of her husband's Hillman Minx, with lighting and shadows matching that captured on March 22nd, as well as believably maintaining the falsehood that the photo was spontaneous and legitimate for decades afterward. It seems we are therefore left with another genuine mystery, perhaps one of the few authentic cases of a ghost caught on film, or perhaps a once-in-a-million accident compounded by false memories. Ghosts have been a part of the human experience since the dawn of recorded history. To have their existence confirmed beyond the shadow of any doubt is a great hope of many, and probably accounts for the fascination we seem to hold for photographs purporting to show them. Whether ghosts are objectively real, or an ancient enthralling fantasy born of fear and wonder, the idea they could be real is infinitely tantalizing, like the light streaming in from beneath a closed door at the end of a long, dark hallway.